wanted to focus on was the constitutional amendment limiting recalls.
Sure.
Has it garnered a lot of support?
It sounds to me like when I talk to most of my constituents, the vast majority are in favor of making changes. The one thing it seems like almost every Wisconsinites agree on is that they're glad recalls are finished. Even the poll that came out recently showed that the vast majority of Wisconsinites don't even want to recall Governor Walker, even though his support is kind of 50-50. I think people have realized that recalls not only are bad for democracy, but I think they're really bad for governing in general. We know that when the recalls began, governing in Wisconsin kind of stopped. The reason that the legislature didn't come right back in with the full agenda is because we spent the entire summer going around listening to negative commercials instead of actually listening to our constituents and talking about how to create jobs. So my fear is that if Wisconsin enters a period where we have perpetual campaigns, where special interest groups can hire signature gatherers just to create political chaos, we will make difficult decisions even more difficult to reach consensus.
And then the critics are saying that the recall process is already difficult and convoluted. What do you have to say about that?
Well, if you go back and read the history, when the recalls were put into effect in the Constitution by only a 4,000 vote margin statewide back in the 1930s, the fear was it would end up becoming a perpetual campaign cycle. That's why they have been used rarely. And I think most people already have the belief that it's really for misconduct in public office. 19 states currently allow recalls, 31 don't allow any recall whatsoever. Neither does the federal government. You have the opportunity to change at election time, not in between. So when I look at where Wisconsin is, we are one of the very most liberal allowing recalls to occur for any reason whatsoever. So our amendment doesn't change the amount of signatures that's needed. It doesn't make it more difficult to collect them by banning paid signature gatherers, which is primarily the way the last ones were done. All it says is you have to have a reason. Somebody has to commit some kind of a breach of the public trust, not a difference of opinion. Really what happened is, if you remember, the recalls were launched because people said that there was this breach of public trust because of the changes in collective bargaining privileges. But there is not one ad that I saw anywhere that talked about collective bargaining. It was all about political power, and it was about federal issues, which had nothing to do with why the recalls were even launched. So I think if it was about a reason, and you stated it was even because of the collective bargaining vote, then maybe you would campaign on that and people would make their decision on that single issue. But it wasn't about that, it was about political power. And I think that's exactly why having the ability to recall for any reason at any time is like a cancer on democracy. Elected officials almost always are always challenged to try to make hard decisions in difficult times. We did it this time. We balanced the budget without raising taxes, and we did it in a way that was somewhat controversial to some people in Wisconsin even today. But knowing that you have an opportunity to explain yourself and to go back and explain to voters why what you did is showing that it works is part of what democracy is. I hope that's the route that we would go to keep recalls rare and to keep them, hopefully, something that would be only utilized for the most extreme circumstances.
You mentioned the perpetual campaign and election cycle, and that's something else I wanted to talk about. Do you feel as though with the protesters having a constant presence in the Capitol, do you feel that that constant fatigue of needing to campaign?
Not necessarily any more than normal. I mean, during the course of the first few months, it was obviously stressful for almost everyone who was here just because the protesters were in your face, and some, even the most radical extreme, are still left. As I look at what we need to do in order to try to move toward the future, we always should be responsive to our constituents, and I am. I mean, I still call back constituents. I still was at events this last weekend, and I go almost every weekend listening to what people who are my employers want me to do in the district back here in Madison when I come to the Capitol. The difference is knowing that you have radical protesters who are trying to scream and shout and use any means necessary to try to explain why they think changing political power is necessary for their own beliefs. I just don't think that's productive, and I hope that it would be something that would become even more rare than it has been. We had a report that was done this week by the Government Accountability Board where we actually tried to figure out the cost for taxpayers, not all the money that was spent on TV ads and union organizing and all that stuff, but how much was actually out of the taxpayers' dollars, and it was over $2 million. So when we look at the costs on local governments, which are already strapped for money to pay for parks and to pay for roads and to pay for human services, now we're asking them to also fund campaigns run by special interest groups, once again purely for political purposes. So I hope that we would, if not looking for what it's doing to democracy as the cancer that I think it is, I think we should also look at what it's doing to local budgets and say whether or not we can afford to have elections every year more often than we already do.
It's actually one of the things we're writing about today. Is we've talked to a couple different county clerks, and a lot of them have Kenosha spent over $100,000 on the primary and the recall itself. It does seem to be, and I spoke with a gentleman from the sing-along as well, and pretty much everyone's agreed that it is a drain on taxpayers, the taxpayer dollar, but where they differ is whether or not it was a significant use of their money.
It's interesting that when we go through the budget, we have to make hard decisions. We can only spend the amount of money that comes in the till. And I think that local governments are even better at that than the state is, because we can usually transfer between funds. But if you're a local government, especially a small municipality, and you have to spend $10,000 or $20,000 on an election that you didn't plan for, that's money that you're not going to spend on improving a park or rebuilding a road or potentially trying to do good things for your community. So I hope this is an area where people would really look and say, is having constant elections, because we're not talking about the past. Once again, if we have this amendment go forward, it's adopted by the legislature this session, there's an election in the middle, the next session has to actually occur and adopt it, and then it has to go to a vote of the people. So the very earliest this could get on the ballot is April of 2013. So it's not like we're rushing through to try to prevent the recalls. What I'm trying to do is to look at the future and say, our entire history, we've only had a few recalls, and then all of a sudden we had 9, and we're talking to now about another half a dozen in the spring. And if we're going to have constant recalls, we need to stop it now before the problem really gets out of hand.